Hello, and welcome to the final day of this year's Confetti Industry Week. What a week it's been. Yesterday we had the Warlord Games takeover, which was absolutely fantastic. And don't forget to tag us in with IW21 when you do your social media posting this week. We want to see how you're watching this week's Industry Week. Maybe you're doing something a bit different. Maybe you know a couple of the games. We want to see it. Make sure you hashtag IW21 on your social media this week. Now, we have Sally Blake, who's worked on many games such as Watch Dogs, The Division, and Just Dance. And we are really excited for her to have a quick talk to us about her time in the industry and all the stuff she does at the moment at Silent Games. Now, this is this year's 15th year of Confetti Industry Week, and we are so excited for everyone to be in. Make sure you're using the chat function quite professionally, and at the end we'll do a Q&A function, so we would love to see your questions and we'll get through as many of them as possible. But I'll hand you straight over to Sally right now and we'll say hello.
Hey everybody! I can't believe there's 150 people. That's really exciting. Thanks very much for coming to my talk. Appreciate it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen so you can see what I'm going to talk about. I think that will help. Can everybody see that? All good to go? Awesome. So yes, I'm Sally, I'm from Silent Games, and today I'm going to be talking to you about basically production processes and how to successfully plan and launch a game. And I'm going to take you all the way from pre-production to the launch of the game and also beyond launch, because obviously a lot of games these days have post-launch content. So for people that are interested in that, I'm going to be talking about that as well. The agenda is basically split in two. So we have project phases. So I'm going to talk about pre-production, production, closing, post-launch, and maybe a little bit more as well. And then I'm also going to talk about the day-to-day of game development. So things like sprint planning, which you may have heard of, daily stand-ups, sprint reviews, and sprint retrospectives as well. So yeah, hopefully there's going to be tons of useful information for any kind of discipline, whether you're an artist, a programmer, or you're just interested in the game industry in general. There'll be something here for you so you can understand the entire structure of how a game is made. Just a little bit about me then. So yes, I am the CEO of Silent Games. I co-founded the studio a couple of years ago and we're working on an RPG game right now, unannounced title at the moment. I also spent 6 years at Ubisoft. So I did a couple of years as a games tester. I was testing Just Dance, and then I moved on to test Watch Dogs. And then after I'd spent a bit of time in QA, I moved on to production. So producers, I'm going to talk a little bit about that later, what producer's role is and how that intertwines with the milestones that you have in project management and development. So yeah, you'll find out a bit about that then. I also spent 3 years in independent game development as well and publishing. So yeah, I spent a couple of years in AR and VR. So if anyone's interested in that field, I can definitely answer questions on that as well. And I spent some time in publishing, as I mentioned, with a company called No More Robots. And they've released tons of great games like Yes Your Grace, Descenders. So yeah, that was really valuable experience as well. And then the rest of the time I've spent at Silent Games, and I'm at full-time at Silent Games now with a team up in Newcastle upon Tyne. We've got 14 people working for us at the moment. And like I said, we already mentioned, I worked on Just Dance, Watch Dogs, The Division, a bit of The Division 2 as well, and then a bunch of indie titles as well. And I have a little video reel of the games that I've worked on. So if we want to queue that up and play that so everyone can have a look, that'd be great. So that, yeah, hopefully gives you a little bit of insight into the kind of games that I've worked on. Can you still see the presentation, by the way, or do I need to reshare it?
That's okay.
Need to reshare it?
Yeah, if you could reshare, that'd be
Yeah,
fantastic.
no problem. We'll do now. There, is that all good? Can you all see that now?
Yeah, we can see it.
Fabulous, fabulous. Okay, so let's start at the beginning then. Project phases. What kind of phases do we have in game development and what do they all mean? So firstly, and I'm hoping that people will be familiar with most of these, we have pre-production. And during pre-production, you will have normally prototyping, you may make a demo or you may make a vertical slice. During production, there's various milestones, the most common being alpha and beta. And then we have the closing period in which you might have data lock, code lock, gold, sometimes called candidate master, and then the launch. And then post-launch, normally you will have those milestones throughout and it's treated like a mini project. So you start the cycle again. Sometimes when with post-launch content, people will start working on that while the main production of the game is in progress already. So there's some overlap there so that it can be ready for when the game's launched. There's things like day one bug fixes that you want to do as well. So there is some overlap there. And also, in terms of the production processes, they can vary greatly depending on the studio. And I've been at a few different studios that have different methods. Particularly the biggest difference is between independent game development and AAA development. And those differences come from personal preference sometimes or the needs of the studio. So it's worth bearing in mind, but the majority of the time, every studio will have a pre-production, production and closing phase at the very least. In terms of prototyping, and demos, vertical slices, sometimes that is done with the aim of getting investment. Sometimes if you're working at a company like Ubisoft, which already, Ubisoft are a publisher, they already have the funds. It's more to figure out what the game is going to look like when you ultimately release it. Obviously, AAA companies invest a lot in their IP, so they want to test what it's going to look like. And sometimes it will also be used for marketing assets at places like E3 and online as well. So yeah, it's just worth mentioning that. So I've structured this basically so you can see who will be involved at the pre-production stage, why it's actually done, and how it's actually done. So I'll talk through a few of the points on the how. There's quite a lot there, and each of those could be a presentation in itself, but I just wanted to cover the core things. So normally in pre-production, the core team is involved. So obviously the whole team won't be rolling on at this phase because you won't have a concept for the game yet. You're starting from the very beginning. And even in a sequel, usually the core team will only be the people involved at this point, just because you're trying to develop the structure of the game and too many cooks, all that kind of thing. So the core team usually consists of the game director, the creative director, the tech director, and the production director. And there might be a couple more people involved as well, but that's usually who forms the core team to decide what direction the game is going to go in and to do the initial pre-production phase. Indie teams may include everyone. So if you have a very small team that's 4 to 5 people, you all might be doing that brainstorming together. Or if you're a very, very small indie and you're just a solo dev at that point, then it will probably just be you. So again, there's some variation between indie and AAA, but it's just worth knowing who's involved and what kind of things are done at this stage. In terms of why you have a pre-production stage and don't just go into the full development of the game and ramp everybody up and hire everyone straight away, you really want to have a clear established vision for the game to communicate to the team. It also decreases the risk as well. So of course, if you're going to invest a lot of money into an IP, you want to make sure that you've done your research. You want to make sure that you've had the opportunity to prototype things, because game development is very, very iterative. You're not going to create a feature and it's going to be perfect first time. And particularly if you're doing anything innovative or new or something that people haven't done before, you definitely want to make sure that that's going to work out. And that's the place where pre-production really, really helps, because you're able to take those risks and to establish those pipelines early on so that you're decreasing the risk for the full production. It gets the team on the same page as well. One of the things that makes great games is just clarity of vision and having good communication with the rest of the team. So if you're in a place where you're still trying to figure everything out and you don't have a clear vision for the game, trying to roll everyone on at the same time can be a bit difficult because you don't have the headspace to establish what that is. So doing that kind of work up front and then getting feedback from the team when you have a clear picture in your mind of what you want can really help. And it's not to say getting the team involved is a detriment. It definitely helps for them to look at what you have once you have it and work through that as a team. But it's good to have that initial idea yourself first. And then also it prepares you for investment and publishing as well. So again, you can't just go to a publisher or an investor without a pitch, without a clear vision for the game, without proving that the risky parts of your game are going to come to fruition. So it prepares you for all of that. And there's lots of things that you do during pre-production that go into your pitch, and it will help you in production as well. And that includes things like your game pillars. So I'm going to talk a little bit about game pillars, which I'm hoping most people will be familiar with. The art direction of your game as well. Sometimes you'll do a narrative overview. So if you have a story heavy game, or you're creating an RPG or something, or a narrative based game like a visual novel, then obviously the narrative overview is very important here as well. Another key thing that you will establish during pre-production is the feature list. And this is trying to establish the features that you're going to have in your game. So when you come to production, you don't miss anything out. And this includes pretty much everything that you'll find in the game, the save and load system, the main menus, the combat system, anything that you'll have in your game, it wants to be in the feature list. And most studios will have this as a way to track how they're doing on the project and to just keep track of everything that needs to be done. And this is usually prioritized. So I do have like a little screenshot of a feature list to show you later. By the way, while I'm reading through this list, not every studio will do all of these. It's very much dependent on what's beneficial for them in pre-production, what type of game you're making. So some of these you might not need, but I wanted to share the fundamentals because AAA studios normally do all of these just to be on the safe side. And if you're starting a company or you're developing a game yourself, these are some tools that you can use to figure out what you want to do and figure out where you want to go, but you don't necessarily have to do all of them. Another thing that studios usually look at in pre-production is the technical infrastructure, particularly if you're doing something complicated like an online multiplayer game. You want to be thinking about how that works on a technical level, and just having those conversations early can be really helpful as well. It just means that you're not starting technical debt before you even begun. And then market research and forecasting is really important as well, because you want to make sure that your game is sustainable, that you are going to be able to continue making games, because that's usually the aim of the studio, is that you make a game and you're financially stable enough to continue making games. So just having that early research on how your game fits within the market can really help as well. And then the prototype and the vertical slice, again, is important. So the difference between a prototype and a vertical slice is the prototype is usually okay being white box. It's usually okay being quite unfinished and just showing a small subset of the game without final assets. Whereas a vertical slice is very much a very small part of the game that's been taken to final. So it looks like it will look on release as close as possible. And some investors like to see a vertical slice, particularly if you're in the AA or AAA space. But with independent publishers, they're usually happy to see an early prototype or something that's a little more unfinished, as long as it's showing the core loop of the game. So it's worth bearing that in mind, that obviously there's two stages, and whether or not you need to take something to vertical slice depends on where you're trying to go and who you're trying to pitch to. Then you'll also have the high level budget and the timeline. These are super, super critical, because a lot of people forget the production side of things, and you get really caught up in designing the game and thinking of all these cool game ideas, and the budget is probably less glamorous and less fun to do, but it's so vital if you're looking for investment, and it's just vital for yourself as well to just make sure that your development's sustainable and you can actually do it within a reasonable time frame with the people that you have. So yeah, whether or not you're a very, very small indie or a AAA, I always recommend doing a budget and a timeline, just to keep yourself grounded and make sure what you're doing is going to fit. Competitor analysis, I always find these really fun and I love doing them. It's basically just looking what else is out there that's similar to your game, playing it, evaluating the pros and cons. If there's a game that's done particularly well, analyzing why it's done really well, looking at all the player reviews and feedback and just seeing what players are really engaging with at the moment. I just find that really fun. It's just an opportunity to play games. So obviously I recommend doing that, for sure. Just playing games in a similar space to where you're trying to pitch is really helpful. And then last but not least, fundraising. If you already have funds, if you've already mapped out how you're going to finance the game, you don't need to go through the kind of investment or publisher treadmill. But during pre-production, once you have the documents that I've kind of listed here, that's the point at which you'd start doing fundraising, talking to publishers, talking to investors to try and get the initial funds to start building your team and building your game. So yeah, that's a kind of summary of the pre-production phase. And I usually find it's one of the most fun kind of parts of the production process, because you're coming up with all these game ideas, you're hashing things out with the team, the core team, and yeah, it's just a really good like innovation and exploratory phase that's just really exciting to be in. And currently at Silent Games, this is where we are with our game. So loads of ideas of going back and forth, and yeah, it's been really fun so far. So I just wanted to talk a bit about a couple of those things in a bit more detail, in terms of what they actually look like, what they're for. Game pillars are really, really vital for, again, establishing that clear direction for the game. You can have pillars for the whole game, which I've got here, the God of War pillars. So they had combat, they had father and son relationship, and then they had exploration, and then a few points underneath. And these really help you make core decisions about the game. So if you're wanting to implement a feature and you're like, well, this is a really cool feature, you also need to ask yourself, does it fit with my game? Does it fit with the core pillars that we have decided for our game? Because there's plenty of cool things you can do that might not synergize with your game. So having these as a starting point can really, really help. And there's a really good PlayStation blog, which I've linked here, which we can share after, that talks about how God of War did those pillars and how the Sony studios managed to kind of decide what these are. And also these are things that are very memorable, so they'll be repeated over and over throughout the production cycle, to the point where people get kind of sick of them. But yeah, they're really important for key decision making. They're very memorable, and it just means that you're able to maintain focus in the game development as well. And we have pillars for the game, but also each part of the environment we have pillars for. If you're doing something particularly different with the environment, you could have pillars for those as well. So it's basically just about figuring out where you think they're going to be valuable. And it also sparks some really interesting conversations with the team. You can chop and change these while you're in the pre-production phase, but after pre-production, you want these to be solidified, unless you're changing direction drastically, then you kind of want these to be solidified and memorable and focused. So yeah, definitely recommend doing game pillars if you're looking to start your own game. Of course, art direction is incredibly important. There's actually loads of art direction documents available online. So if you wanted to see an example of what those look like, they deal with things like color theory, textures. They have lots of reference images from other games or other works of art in them, and that helps you establish the visual language for your game. Even if your game is not like a particularly art focused game, it's still really useful to do this just so you have a consistent style. And yeah, it's about setting a box of rules for your artists to work in. It just creates a consistency, it creates boundaries so that they can figure out a consistent style, especially if you're in a big studio that has lots of different artists with their own personal styles working on something. You want to find consistency there, so everything can look like it's part of the same universe, part of the same game. And yeah, this is kind of part of a quote from Jamie, who has worked on BioShock and Gears. And yeah, there's a really good article about how to establish a good art direction. And this is something, again, that we're working on right now. And there's loads of resources online for that. And it's, yeah, like I said, if you just Google like game art direction document, there's loads online that you can actually look at from games that have already released, and you can see how they develop their characters, their environments, their assets, their visual language, any symbology in the game. Yeah, it's super useful. Like I said, even if it's not an art-based game, it's still really, really useful. Then here is what a very basic feature list might look like. It doesn't need to be anything super, super fancy, but it enables you to see the high level scope of the entire game at a glance. This is just some placeholder stuff that I put here for you to have a look at. But yeah, it's used for prioritization as well. So you can see here things that are very high, things that are uncuttable. They need to be there when you ship. There's no compromising on them. They are there. They are the core part of the game. Things that are high are obviously important, but you can maybe spend a bit less time on them, or if you need to put them in post-launch, you can do that. Same with mid and low stuff. Low is the first thing that gets cut if you're really struggling with your production timeline, or it's something that you roll later and put in your DLC content. put in post-launch if, like photo mode, speed mode, things that players like and appreciate, but don't have to be there from day one. And yeah, it's just the start of the overall planning process for your game. So once you've got the high level concept for your game, you've got the pitch, you've got a good idea of what your game is going to be, you can then start breaking it down into these high level features just to make sure you've not missed anything. And there is some stuff on here that you might consider, boring or not necessary to put, but it's very easy to forget about them if you don't, like loading screens and tool tips and things like that. And like I say, save loading. This isn't a full list, but you'll have save loading settings, all that kind of stuff that needs to be there. So it's just making sure you don't forget anything. It also helps when you come to design each feature. The designer has a very clear list of things that they need to work on and need to design. So yeah, it just really helps as a starting point. And you can estimate this very, very loosely at the beginning. And once you have a clearer idea and you keep honing down on what these features actually mean in the designs of them, you can hone down the estimates as well. And this is what I also use to establish the timeline and budget for the game. So once I've got these estimates in place, I'll then transfer them to a timeline and put them where it makes sense based on who I've got working on the project. And that enables you to make sure that you're within the scope. So if you say, I want to make a game in 1.5 years, you can put these estimates on a timeline and figure out, okay, that's achievable with this many team members or not. So this is the starting point for all of your production processes and documents. So yeah, also it tracks the status of things as well. So just so you know what's in development and what isn't. There are many, many ways to do that at a task level rather than like on here. But it is good to just show what things have been signed off. So, okay, we've finished with bosses. They've been signed off. The game director's happy with them. We're going to work on something else now and move on. It's just a good way to see that at a glance. So yeah, hopefully it's been helpful to see that visually. It does help, I think. So next is the production phase, which is the biggest part of the game development. Basically, it's the majority of your project, and the whole team will gradually ramp up during production. How gradual depends on the team. It depends on how many people, how many leads you have that are able to ramp people up. Depends on your recruitment process and your hiring plan. We ramped up super fast at Silent Games. So yeah, that was cool. But yeah, it's the core part of making the game where the bulk of the work will actually happen. And how you make sure that your production goes smoothly is establish clear goals for the team, establish clear milestones, regularly review content, and also something that's really valuable, of course, is play tests and player feedback. When I was at Ubisoft, they were very big on playtesting. So that's when players will come into the studio, they'll test the game for a couple of hours, they'll give you feedback, and then that gets sent back to the development team to, be worked on. And in post-launch as well, you'll find that the community developers will gather player feedback and then we'll all evaluate it as a team. Ubisoft also had, when I worked on the division, something called the ETF, which is like the elite task force. And that was some veteran division players that had spent hundreds of hours in the game, either people that we knew had a lot of play time, had platinumed the game, or people who had streamed the game, or content creators. They'd come in and give us feedback about the game as well. So there's so many avenues to do that. And yeah, this is part of kind of the production phase here. So I wanted to talk about the sort of milestones you will see. So I picked the most common ones because sometimes companies will have their own internal milestones as well, which are called totally different things and have totally different definitions. Sometimes they'll be called production gates. Sometimes they'll be called just milestone 1, milestone 2, and they'll have their own definitions of what's expected. And that comes from the timeline that I mentioned before. Once it's mapped on a timeline, gates will be established throughout the game, especially for a large AAA game. Alpha and beta are usually, you need milestones in between. But with alpha, again, depends on the company, but this is a general definition of what alpha will mean. And it's really good to set an alpha for your game as well, and to set these gates, because it means you have an evaluation point where everybody's looking at the game holistically. Because it's very easy to get focused on your own thing. It's very easy for an artist to just focus on their thing and not look at the bigger picture or whoever's working on the game. So super important. Alpha basically means that everything is functional but placeholder. The art, UI, and audio is not final, and it's used to check the minute-to-minute gameplay, the level design, and the pacing of the game. And there are usually kind of 2 ways you can go about doing a production schedule. The first is having everything in an alpha state. So the whole game is playable, but everything is white box, everything is placeholder, everything is functional, but doesn't look like it will ultimately. And that's a good way sometimes if you're making a game that has very core loops that need to synergize with each other. So RPGs are a common example of that. Dungeon diving games or anything like that, where all of the systems need to work in harmony together. You need to test them. That's a good way to develop your production schedule. The other way is basically to work feature by feature and take all of the individual features up to final before moving on to the next one, which is a bit more of an old school way to do it, but it is beneficial for some games that are very focused on art or very focused on like having chapters, like narrative chapters and things like that. You might want to do it that way. But usually everything will be white boxed and it's used to check that overall kind of feel of the game. At this point, some studios will get playtesters involved, but a lot of the time, particularly AAA, they'll want to wait until beta when there's actually final artwork, because it's quite hard to imagine the visual language of the game when it's like in this state. So it's usually better for players to play it at beta. And early access will normally be at beta technically as well. Sometimes they're like, it's an early alpha, but it has like final art in it and stuff, which isn't exactly how it is internally most of the time. So yeah, alpha. And then we have beta, which is basically everything is functional with art that could be considered final, except the last things remaining, which is usually the stage between beta and gold, is bug fixing and optimization. Everything is present art. Everything is present art-wise with the exception of those things. And then also balancing is usually something that's left till after beta as well. So that window between beta and gold is preparing the game for submission. If you're doing a console game, there's a run-up and there's requirements you need to meet for Sony and Microsoft, Nintendo. So that's the point at which you'll be checking you've met all of those requirements. That's good to do as early as possible, but it usually does happen between beta and gold, so you know what the game's going to ultimately be at beta. And balancing, bug fixing, optimization happens at that point as well. So beta is going to give you a really good impression of the state of the game. It's going to give you a good impression of the visuals. Even though there's a few more tweaks to be done, it should really be mostly finished at this point, with the exceptions that I've mentioned, so that the stronger the beta that you have, the more comfortable you're going to be with your goals and with your submission. So you really want to be in a good place for beta, and that's the point where you want to knuckle down and make sure that this is a really strong milestone. I think it's probably, just in my opinion, it's one of the most important throughout your development timeline. So, and as I said, this is where sometimes you'll get play testers in to give you feedback, because you've still got that period of time between beta and gold to make some changes. And to be fair, between alpha and beta, maybe halfway between alpha and beta, you'll get play testers in so you can fix stuff for beta as well. So yeah, hope that makes sense in terms of the timeline. And then last but not least is the closing phase, which is really, really, really important. And there are obviously games that have quite a struggle during the closing phase, because there'll be tons and tons of bugs. There'll be technical debt that's been built up because things haven't been evaluated soon enough, and that can be quite tricky. So the closing phase is also very key. And this is where QA functionality will ramp up dramatically. If you're working on a large game, this is where external QA, so QA that are not in the studio, but maybe outsourced QA, have been hired to really test the game and to make sure that it's functioning as it should. And all of your bug fixing and stuff will normally happen during this phase. To be fair, you can fix bugs throughout, and it is recommended that you don't leave major bugs in the game throughout development, but this is just where you'll fix all those kind of little issues that have been building up over time. And also at this point during the closing phase, you might find that some of the core team members start rolling onto DLC for the next project or the sequel of the game, because they've done their job, they've set the vision for the game. They'll still be playing the game in the closing phase normally and giving feedback, but it will also be the time where they start splitting their time between the next DLC or the new piece of content, and just there's that overlap there. Just to make you aware. And why we have a closing phase and you don't just roll from production to launch is, it's there to improve the overall quality of the game. It's there to help with the game stability. It's there to solve any major issues that players might have in that playtesting phase that I mentioned that you have. And optimization is super important as well, especially if you're going to ship on console. This is the point at which you'll be knuckling down on that. And yeah, it's the place where you can ensure you get the best out of each platform as well. So if you have any features that are specific to the PS4, PS5, or the Xbox, this is the time at which you want to be evaluating that and making sure you're getting the best out of the platforms. And as I mentioned, making sure you're ready for those first party requirements, because they're very different between each company. Nintendo, Sony, and Microsoft have very different requirements a lot of the time. So you need to make sure that you meet them. That's the point where you make sure. And how is this done? So a lot of the time there'll be, I've seen indie studios do this less just because there's less people, so it gets less chaotic and there's more communication. It's very easy to have those communication between 5 people or whatever. But if you've got hundreds of people working on a game at once, it's very easy to break stuff in the build, and you don't want to be the person that breaks stuff. So a code lock process or an art lock process is put in place, which means that at this point you can't check any more art into the main build. Only critical bug fixes or must fixes can go in at this point. Same with code. And usually the way it's rolled out is you will have the art lock first, and then if there's any code fixes that need to be fixed based on the art, the programmers have time and space to make those fixes. And yeah, this is also the point at which anything that's really not working for the game, any features that are just not there and are not going to be there, you can descope or deprioritize them, move them into post-launch if you're not sure that players are going to be happy with the quality of them. It's usually better to, instead of releasing something broken and buggy, it's better to take a bit more time on it. And especially in the kind of world of live games now and the world of DLC, we do have the opportunity to fix things later and to make sure they're polished before they go out. Whereas before it'd be just like, you launch the game and what you launch is what you get. So now we do have an opportunity to fix things. So yeah, that's the point at which that'll happen if those changes need to be made to the schedule. Sometimes before beta, that those choices can be made as well, because there's always regular review points, which I'm going to talk about later in terms of like the day-to-day review process and sprints, agile, and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's part of that whole system. So yeah, as I explained, data and code lock, it streamlines the build. The aim here is to get stability. So you don't want to be checking in new content at this point. You don't want to be checking in new art assets. You don't want to be checking in new levels. You don't want to be doing anything too crazy, although people try to, because they're like, let me just tweak that. I want to make that better. And that's nice, but also it can cause loads of bugs. I've seen people like cause 10 more bugs when they fixed one bug. So you've got to be very careful about what goes into the game at this point. But yeah. And then, yeah, Sony and Microsoft having these rules, very important. And yeah, you just want to make sure your game meets all of those requirements. And then lastly is post-launch, which some games don't have if it's a standalone, single player, doesn't have any post-launch content. But obviously, most AAA games now have some kind of post-launch. And most indie games have at least a day one patch or a place where they'll fix bugs now, whereas in the past it'd be just like, one and done, you leave it, you have your launch party, and then you have a big old holiday. Not so much now. You're always going to be continue working on the game. So in terms of who works post-launch, normally the team is a bit smaller. People start to roll off onto either the sequel, a different game, and it'll be a smaller team that maintains the main game and continues to work on it. And it's done, obviously, to improve the perception of the game from players. You can really sometimes turn things around if your launch didn't go as you expected, or there was some severe bugs, or there was something that completely blindsided you. This is a way to kind of get that faith back from the players. It's also a way to just listen to the community as well, because when you're making a game, you're very close to it. It's hard to see how it will be interpreted by players. It's hard to know. And obviously the play testers that you have, they will sometimes be coming back and playing the game multiple times. There's things that just happen when it's put out in the world on a grand scale that you just didn't expect. So this is definitely a way to have that back and forth with players and have that communication so you can understand what's gone wrong, what's gone well, what they liked, what they didn't like. Analytics come into this as well, because in post-launch, people will be, especially at big studios, will be analyzing all of the analytics. So how long players are spending in levels, how long they're spending in the game, how they're interacting with the game. This is the point where all that will be analysed as well. And yeah, it just increases longevity and player interest, particularly with AAA games now. You can imagine the budget and the investment is so large that you really want players to keep playing. And we're finding that just statistically players are playing less games, but they're playing them for much longer now for obvious reasons, because there's post-launch content and there's games where you can play them for hundreds and hundreds of hours now, whereas in the past you get a 20-hour game, be satisfied and be done with it. Whether or not that's good or bad is very personal taste kind of thing, really. But yeah, the aim is to obviously get players playing the game and to keep them playing, and by doing that, like by adding quality of life features, adding DLC, adding new content, you keep them coming back to the world that you've created, and you create that investment in the IP as a whole. So yeah, that there is benefits to doing that as well. And then a lot of the time, how this is done, there's a big collaboration at this point with a community development team. So on the Division, they had the state of the game, which was a Twitch stream, regular Twitch stream, where people would give feedback to the dev team and have that back and forth with players about what's upcoming, what's going to be changed, what's going to be fixed. And the community developers as well they do I've read a few times where people will leave a comment and they're like, the dev will never read this comment, and I'm like, I'm reading it right now, especially if it's a mean one. I'm just like, oh, I'm reading it. But yeah, so the community developers will be gathering all of that information and feeding that back to the dev team so we can make improvements. And it doesn't mean that we always do everything that the community wants for a bunch of reasons. Like sometimes it's not technically possible, sometimes it doesn't fit with the direction of the game in general, sometimes it'll break other systems or break the economy of the game. So there's lots of things to consider when taking feedback from the community, but definitely that back and forth is normally how things are addressed. And yeah, post-launch begins the production cycle again, especially for big DLC content. If you're doing a huge patch which brings new levels, new environment art, and just basically like a mini game within the big game, you will start the entire production process again. So you'll start pre-production on the DLC, you'll do the production phase, you'll do a closing phase on the DLC itself, and start that whole thing again, basically. So yeah, that's pretty much everything in terms of the overall overarching high-level process. And like I said, that's the span of the entire project. And the next thing that I think is really useful to know about is just the day-to-day process, like how a game's actually planned on a day-to-day. Because if you think about a project that spans 3 or 4 years, it's very hard to imagine like how every little thing gets done. And again, another disclaimer on here, the day-to-day process varies hugely between teams. Like I've been on so many teams that have all their own different processes. Teams, a lot of the times it's just personal preference. Sometimes it depends on what type of game you're making, whether it's a live service game or not, or there's loads of different reasons to do different things for different teams. And yeah, most people also, if you're very familiar with like Agile and Scrum principles, they're not always followed to the letter in games, which sometimes upsets people who really like Agile and Scrum by the book. Sometimes in games, people just do what they want with it. And you have to be adaptable and get used to that, basically. So I just wanted to start by explaining the difference between Agile and Scrum. If you're familiar with them or not, it's just helpful to know, because to be honest, I'm not gonna lie, I sometimes forget this and use the two interchangeably, which upsets producers. So I'm trying not to do that. But Agile is basically a production approach or a theory to how you can manage your production processes. So it's about individuals and interactions over having heavy processes and tools all the time. It's meant to be a very easy way of working, an iterative way of working, and it's basically about having a working piece of software, in this case games, that you're constantly reviewing and testing. And I do think the reason why this works well for games is because sometimes you can document the heck out of something, and then when you put it in the game, it's completely not what you expected. It plays horribly, it doesn't fit with the rest of the systems, and you only know that by playing it. And that happens so often in game development, where you have this amazingly cool idea in your head and it's just total garbage when it's in the game, or the other way around, which is why having this iterative process is really important. And yet they say, you know, it's about customer collaboration. It's about hearing what the player wants and trying to work from that, instead of trying to just do everything by a very kind of comprehensive contract, planning things up front to the point where you're just spending so much time in documentation, not actually playing the product that you're making. And it's about being adaptable as well. So the priority is responding to change, responding to those iterations, and not just barreling on with the plan. So if you're playing something and you're like, this doesn't feel right, sometimes the temptation is just like, well, that was part of the plan and I don't want to change it all now, so much will change. It's kind of the opposite of that. You want to be changing things if you really feel it's necessary and you feel it's going to basically make a better game. And the whole framework of this is designed to help you do that instead of, because managing that can be quite tricky. If something major has to change, it has a knock-on effect on loads of other things. The whole Agile process is meant to manage that way of working, basically. And Scrum is the way of implementing the Agile theory. So it describes like this set of meetings, tools and roles that work to help teams manage this. So this is the actual sprint planning, sprint retrospectives, daily stand-ups, which I'm hoping like most people will be familiar with in terms of game development. If you've watched any production talks, you'll probably be familiar with that terminology, which I'm going to explain as well, just so you know. So yeah, a sprint is basically a short time box period where a Scrum team works to complete a set amount of work. It can be 1, 2, or 3 weeks. We're currently doing 3-week sprints. Again, whether or not you do 1 or 2 or 3, it's personal preference. I do find that the sprint process is quite meeting heavy. So if you want to spread out the meetings, then 2 or 3 weeks is better than 1 week. Otherwise, you're going to be having a week that's bookended with quite a lot of meetings that are incredibly important, incredibly beneficial to your production process, but there's a lot of them. So you might want to spread it out a little bit, which is why 2 or 3 is more common than 1. And the first meeting that you normally have is the sprint planning meeting. So this is where you establish your goals for the next 2 weeks. So the backlog is normally you're taking the feature list, breaking that down and deciding what to do in the sprint planning meeting. And this is normally a multidisciplinary team. So at Ubisoft, it was feature teams. So, say I had the loadouts team, and it was everybody was working on loadouts for the game, or everyone who was working on weapons for the game, and it's split up that way. So it's not always split up by all the programmers meet together, all the artists meet together, because the important thing is having synergy between teams. Otherwise, you just have something that looks amazing artistically, then doesn't function as you expected. You need to have that crossover. So usually sprint teams are multidisciplinary. If your team is small, like 5 or 6 people, you're an indie team, you might always do this together and you don't need to split it into smaller teams. So yeah, you'll take an item from the backlog, which you will have, and you'll break it down into specific tasks that you need to complete over the next, say, 2 weeks, and those will be estimated by the team, and that sets your kind of roster of tasks for the next 2 weeks. And the reason why sprint planning is good is just because it means that everyone's super clear on what they're going to be doing for the next couple of weeks. You have those conversations about, oh, well, as an artist, I'm doing this, so maybe as a programmer, I need your help with this, and so we need to put a task for you. Those conversations are happening, which means that, yeah, you just have a lot smoother process because you're having those cross-disciplinary talks. And in terms of like software and stuff you can use for this, I use Jira to put all of our sprint stuff in. A lot of people will, in the days when COVID wasn't a thing and we were actually in the office, people would have an actual whiteboard. There's another tool called Miro, which is like a whiteboarding system. So if you wanted to do something more casual than Jira, Miro is really good for this, and it has a template for sprint planning stuff already. And yeah, and this is an example of a task. So yeah, create melee DPS sword for the main character. Okay, that's going to take me 3 days. And then that can be tracked in terms of like, oh, well, it's actually going to take me 4 days. And yeah, you can obviously have that back and forth and just see if your plan is actually going to plan as well. So yeah, the next part of the Scrum process is the daily stand-up. And basically you're talking about what work you did yesterday, what work's going to be done today, and if there's any blockers. And this will be, again, in the same teams that you did the sprint planning in. So it will either be a feature team, or if you're a small team, it'll be the entire team. And yeah, multidisciplinary again. So this happens at the same time every day in the morning. It should be 10 minutes. It shouldn't be like a massive conversation where you're figuring out a bunch of stuff. So if you do find like your conversations in the daily stand-up are like spurring off into other things, you can separate that out and create a meeting for those things. But yeah, the aim of this is to just get everybody talking and to remove any blockers from each other as well. So if the artist is like, oh, I'm really stuck, the programmer will be like, oh, well, maybe I could make you a tool that does that automatically for you. And those kind of conversations have happened a lot in our daily stand-ups. People will be like, oh, can I have a chat with you after about this thing that I was thinking about? So yeah, it's just a good way to start a conversation, especially in the remote days where like you don't see everybody, you don't see people face to face anymore. It's a place where we all have our webcams on, we all talk to each other, we all see each other for at least one part of the day. Yeah, so that definitely helps, I think. And then you have the sprint review at the end of the sprint. So say you have a 2-week sprint. On the Monday, you will do your sprint planning, and then every day up until the last day of the sprint, you'll do your daily stand-up, and then on the Friday, you'll have your sprint review. So this is a review of the game. It includes stakeholders. So if it's a big company, there'll be directors there. It'll be the game director will be there to see what you've been up to. If it's smaller company, might have everybody there. And the main point of the sprint review, one thing I forgot to mention as well, in sprint planning, you set sprint goals based on the tasks that you plan to do. And those goals are like team-wide goals that you're all planning to achieve. And in this review, you're evaluating, did you achieve your sprint goals? You're playing the game. That's the most important thing about the sprint review. You're not like looking at, did we do all the tasks or not? Because that's the least important thing. It's the culmination of the tasks and the playing of the build that's super important. And I've seen like a lot of new teams or indie teams being like, yeah, we completed all our tasks, so we're good. And then they play the game and it's really not good. And like you lose sight of the game being good. So it's not just the task being done that's important, it's actually evaluating the product at the end of it that's super important. And from there, you can have conversations about, okay, so we played, this is what we did, this is what we wanted to achieve. Has it actually worked? Is there anything we need to improve? And if there is, that becomes a task that goes into the backlog, that goes back into the sprint planning. So you have that whole cycle continuing again. And it's just a way to keep track of all of the improvements that are needed. Because sometimes if you have a very casual system where you look at the game kind of anytime or you just play it in your own time, things that need to be changed are not always tracked, they're not always remembered, and you'd be like, oh, I forgot about that. So this is the way to kind of keep track of everything and make sure that you're regularly reviewing the game. So yeah. And then last but definitely not least, this is something that a lot of teams don't do, and it makes me sad because it's really, really important. The sprint retrospective is basically the other side of the coin, and it's not about the game. It's about your processes. It's about how you're working as a team. And this is almost as important as reviewing the game, because if you're not working well as a team, if there's something totally wrong with your processes, if your team doesn't have the right hardware, the right software, the right tools, then you're going to struggle no matter what. And just having a checkpoint where you're regularly evaluating that is just so important. So yeah. In terms of what questions you normally ask in the sprint retrospective, then this is the standardized kind of way of figuring stuff out. You'll ask the team, okay, what worked or went well? And a lot of the time this is super nice. It's a chance for people to like compliment each other or like share achievements that they've made. And it's just a really nice part of the conversation, because yeah, there'll be a lot of people who just nice about each other's work, and having that checkpoint just to do that, like it's nice to have it that comes naturally within the team anyway, so that people are doing that. You don't necessarily have to have this meeting to be like, oh, I love what you've done art-wise, or that piece of code or that tool you made me is awesome. But this is just a place where people can actually reflect on it and say those things if they've forgotten during the week. So that's really nice. And if there's anything that caused problems or failed to work or didn't go well, then this is the point at which you can say that. Now, obviously, the daily stand-up catches blockers. So if there's anything going horribly wrong, you don't have to wait till this meeting to figure that out. This is just something that a lot of the time I find it's like little issues that are just in the back of someone's mind that aren't like super relevant to bring up day to day, but it's just like, actually, yeah, it'd be nice if we had this. This kind of catches those things. So yeah, I find that really useful for improving stuff. And then the third point is just wrapping all of that together. So what can we do differently then? And this is basically where your plan of action comes in. It's like, okay, so we've said those things went well, let's continue doing those things. Or we found these problems. So if these problems exist, how are we going to solve them? What steps are we going to take to overcome those problems? And yeah, that's the point at which you would do all of that. And with these processes in mind, it's covering basically everything in terms of your planning, making sure you're on schedule, making sure the game's actually good, and making sure your team is healthy, your team are motivated, your team are feeling good about the things that you're doing. And if not, they can come to you with any problems, and then they know that there is a process to get them resolved. Don't always need a process to get stuff resolved. It's just nice to have it there for things that just people are just, like I said, in the back of their mind. So yeah. So just to summarize all of that, then you'll have your sprint planning, then you'll have your daily scrums, sometimes called daily stand-ups, you'll have your sprint review and your sprint retrospective, and that cycle continues throughout. Just a quick note as well, whether or not people do this in pre-production is up to the company. Sometimes people like pre-production to be less structured and just like it to be like super free flowing and ideas and all that kind of stuff. We're doing like a low-key version of it in pre-production just for the general structure, just to keep things moving along. But then in production, the estimates will start coming in and we'll start planning things properly, basically. And then in closing, this process is sometimes done in closing, but other times there's a different process that comes into place, which is all about fixing bugs. And it's you're not planning tasks at that point, so it's usually handled differently to this. But this is the main bulk of production, and this is why it's really useful to know, because a lot of studios don't know about this and don't know to do it, or do it in a way that's probably not as helpful, or they miss the sprint retrospective, or that kind of thing. So it is quite a lot of work for a producer to do this, but the benefit it brings, the organization it brings, the problems it solves later on down the line just end up being of value, just because you just save yourself so many headaches by figuring this out early. So yeah, that is the entire presentation. So yeah, hopefully that was a good summary of the day-to-day and the high level, and I'm totally open to questions about the production process, or if you want to ask me about the games I've worked on, or basically anything else, I'm totally happy to answer any questions. So yeah.
That's fantastic. We've got some good questions coming in now. So
amazing.
If you all want to make sure you're getting your questions in on the Q&A function, that'll be fantastic, and we can just bring that up and we'll have a look at some of the questions for you.
Awesome.
So we've actually got a really, really good question from Tom. It says, what is the best way to determine the ideas and your team, which is your team's capable to implement? So what do you do if an idea is too difficult?
That's the point in pre-production where it's really good to do some prototyping or some experimentation. If you want to use an obscure piece of software, for example, and nobody knows how to use it, that's a good point to get people trained on it and to see if they're going to be comfortable with it in production. And it's totally fine to cut your losses at that point as well. Like when you're figuring out your pipelines, if there's something that you're testing and you're just finding it's just not working for you, it's not working for your game, it's okay at that point in pre-production to just like, look, let's sack that off and let's try something else, because that's the point at which you want to be doing it, instead of doing it like halfway through production or at the end of the project. You're just like, oh, everything's falling to pieces and it's not working how I expected, which sometimes happens regardless of how much planning you actually do, and there's ways to solve that, obviously. But yeah, I think the pre-production period is a good time to evaluate everyone's skill sets, find out what gaps are there when you're doing the prototyping phase of the project, and how you pick what you prototype is definitely the most risky things. The most things that you're unsure about, then you need to test those and see that the pipelines work. So yeah, hopefully that helps.
That's actually fantastic. We've actually got a really good question. Well, actually, just complete this from actually Reese here. So you mentioned at the start you worked on different types of games, but what is your opinion on VR? Is it too hyped up, or is it a new way of gaming?
So, I mean, the reason I wanted to work in VR is because I wanted to learn new stuff, and it's a field that I have no idea about. I am a traditional gamer, and I always have been. I love console gaming, and that's my thing. So VR, it's not something that I am like super passionate about in terms of playing it myself. But I know there's a lot of people who are really, really interested in it and are big fans of it. But definitely my expertise and my interest now lie in console games. So it's kind of difficult for me to answer, because there's so many people who are in VR that would be better to answer that question. But it was really interesting while I worked in VR to see the kind of innovations that are coming out of VR, because obviously it's a platform where more experimentation is welcome a lot of the time. There's a lot of new hardware, so it's a super interesting space for that reason. But yeah, my passion is always in PC and console games, so that's where I am now. So yeah.
That's fantastic. That's a really good insight into it. This is actually a bit more of a casual one, but Frankie asks, what's your favourite game you've actually got to work on during your career?
To be honest, there's a few answers to this. So the first game I ever worked on was Just Dance, and then in my interview for Ubisoft, they made me dance to Disturbia by Rihanna. That was part of the interview, and I was just not prepared for that. Yeah, that was really fun. And Just Dance, yeah, like I said, the first project I worked on, the team was amazing, and I just had so much fun because I was the tester, so I was dancing all day for that. And yeah, that was really fun. But I also really liked working on The Division, just because I was on the project for a long time and I got to know the community. I was involved in some of the planning for the elite task force, so the members of the community coming in, and yeah, they were really nice. And I still have like friends from the Division community on Twitter, and they sent me a Christmas present, which was super nice. Like the Division UK people sent me a Christmas present. So yeah, I just really like that community. But then also within publishing, I worked on a lot of indie devs when I worked for No More Robots, and again, they were just awesome people to work with, and yeah, good people in the community there. So I don't know, I've never worked on a game that I haven't liked, so that's very lucky. A lot of times, you know, people might be working on stuff they're not super interested in, but yeah, I've enjoyed working on all of them. So
it's great to see that you've had a passion for all your games you've worked on. It's really
very lucky.
Yeah.
yeah, definitely.
We've got actually a few questions a bit about development, but Sam asks, what percentage of projects would you say, or what percentage of each milestone in the project would it take, and what stages are most likely to cause delays?
So, I mean, let's see. I think pre-production is probably like 10%. It's a short window of time. It's not like a big chunk of the project, but the time you spend in pre-production can differ depending on whether it's a brand new IP, whether you're indie or AAA, or whether it's a sequel. And because if you have baseline and the IP already created, you might spend a bit less time in pre-production. If you're not doing anything particularly experimental technology-wise, you might have a shorter pre-production window. So there's no right like specific answer on that. And then the closing period, again, it really depends on the state of the game at beta. You know, if you're finding that, oh, it's not looking good in terms of the bugs, then you might want to extend the closing period. The vast majority of the time, like, you know, 80% of the time is in the production phase. And different companies have different philosophies on when alpha and beta should be in terms of just the time scale and the timeline. It is good to have like a good length of time between alpha and beta, I find, just because that's the point at which everything is getting refined, and you've got alpha as a milestone to really hone down on what your game is going to be, and you've got all that information from alpha, but you want a good time to actually make those changes between alpha and beta, so you don't want them too close together. But that's just my preference. Like a lot of companies have different ways of doing it. So yeah, hopefully that answers the question, but it varies quite a bit.
That's fantastic, actually. That's a really good part. Kind of maybe branching off from that, we've got a few questions about what causes projects or features in projects to get lost in limbo or lost in the whole development process.
It's there's so many reasons for it. It's like, if people are less passionate about it, then sometimes it just gets lost by the wayside. If people are working on more interesting and innovative stuff, it gets forgotten. If you don't have the production tools in place, like you don't have a feature list, you don't have the task list, it's very easy to forget and miss things. That's why I recommend having it, because to be honest, not like a lot of studios don't have any of that stuff, especially indie studios that don't have producers and don't know where to begin in terms of planning a game. They'll just be like, they'll work on stuff they just feel like working on, and then at the end they'll be like, oh, I totally forgot about saving the game, and now it's really broken, and oh no, everyone's annoyed. So yeah, that can be a reason. Sometimes it's like, especially with big studios, like Ubisoft does a lot of co-development, so it won't be just one studio working on a game, it'll be multiple studios across the world working on a game. And you know, differences in time zones, differences in how people communicate, just information can get lost in terms of what's required for the game, and that's just like a natural human thing to happen if you're dealing with hundreds and hundreds of people. And there are different ways you can communicate across studios, across massive projects, but inevitably things are going to fall through the cracks if you don't have someone checking the overall status of the game. That's why it's really important to play the game. Like I've been in a surprising number of situations where somebody hasn't played the game for months. They've just been very focused on their own little slice of the game and haven't played it, and so much is noticeable instantly when you're playing the game. And I can't hammer home enough. Play your game every week, every day, and then you will see what's missing. But yeah, some people don't. So
that's fantastic. We actually might take it to a little bit of a different topic on this side. We've got a couple of questions, one from David, one from Alistair, talking about what is the process of setting like an indie company, and what advice would you have for maybe like one or two people in this indie studio starting out? How would you say the best way to get your name out, get your brand? What advice would you give them?
Yeah, I could do a whole presentation on this, but basically a good thing, a lot of people want to start their own studio straight out of university, and I highly recommend doing that, because there's so much to learn from a studio. There's so much in the game industry that when I joined Ubisoft, I had no idea about it. My degree didn't teach me some of it, and there was just so much to learn. And while I was in QA, I spoke to every discipline, every job role, and that just gaining that knowledge was very, very beneficial. And just in terms of getting a publisher or an investor, it's really, really important to have experience to back up what you're doing, because if they look at you and you have no experience, it can be quite hard to get investment, because it's going to be a big risk for them to do that. So yeah, I think it's important to have that experience in the background, because Ubisoft carries a lot of weight. Saying, oh, I've got 10 years in experience in the game industry carries a lot of weight. And also another thing is your financial planning. You really need to think about how you're going to fund the company. Before we had a specific investment for the game, we did a lot of freelance work. We also got a UK Games Fund grant. So if you're a new studio and you want to try out being in the studio, then the UK Games Fund is really good, and Transfuser is really good because they will fund your indie studio. And I know a lot of companies and students that have gone down that path. We also got a coronavirus grant, which was good, and that's how we funded the initial demo. So yeah, I think that you need to think about how you're going to fund your company for a bit, because money don't grow on trees. you need to figure that out.
That's fantastic. If you've got any links for stuff like the UK Games Fund or Transfuser, we can make sure we get them shared out with all our participants today. We actually we talked about a bit about experience, but a lot of our students here would be looking to get into the industry. So what advice would you say for them to get a job in the gaming industry?
I wrote a blog about this yesterday, so I'll have to share that after. But basically, I had a list of, it's basically a list of common issues I see with like student portfolios and CVs, and it's surprising like how many commonalities there are. But the first thing that I always see as an issue, or something that I recommend you do, is have like a specialism. A lot of students are still really trying to figure out what they want to do in the industry. So they like, do I want to be a designer? Do I want to be an artist? Do I want to be a programmer? And then their portfolio has all of that on it. So when I look at it, I'm like, I don't know what you want to do exactly. I can't see what job you're applying for based on this portfolio. So making sure you spend the time to figure out what your passion is and what you're good at, and then honing down and focusing on that is really, really useful, I think, because it will just mean that as well, if you found your focus, you're going to spend more time developing skills in that area. Your portfolio is going to be stronger than if you try and spread out all of the skill sets among loads of different disciplines. So that's the most common thing. But I should share that blog post because it has like the top 10 mistakes that I see being made sometimes. So it can be useful to know what those are.
I think that's going to be super handy for everyone, I think, in this chat.
That's good.
No, we actually got a really good question. It's from an anonymous attendee, which is really irritating because it's such a good question. But how do you narrow ideas for the games you make? And is there ever any fear of overscoping your game? So what advice would you have to that?
It's so easy to overscope your game, and honestly, like, even though I'm a producer, I just like adding more and more stuff, but then you've got to obviously have the balance there between, that's why the feature list is useful. The balance between adding new ideas and polishing the ideas that you already have is really important. And in terms of if you have loads and loads of ideas for a game, I do think doing the market research is a place where you can kind of hone down on what you think is actually going to resonate with players. So if you have multiple ideas of different genres and things like that, then you can obviously use market research to figure out where that product is going to lie, because that, marketing and how you sell the game and how it resonates with players is half the battle. A lot of the time you can make an awesome game, and if nobody sees it and it's not something that people want to play, it's just something that you personally want to make, then there's a difference between that and something that is going to sell well and something you like making. So it is useful to think about that, even though it feels kind of like, oh, businessy. It is useful because it will help you continue making games, and it will help you make games that resonate with players, and players really will want to play for years to come. So I think that's
actually a really, really good insight on this side. I've actually got a really, really good question, which kind of branches off from that. It's from Josiah. But do you take any ideas from your previous projects or maybe previous pre-production stages that didn't work and then recycle them into a different game?
Yes, because starting everything from scratch is just very risky. It's good to build on knowledge that you have. And if you are going to make a new IP, you're going to make a new game, it is good to have some innovations and some things you are certain are going to work, that are tried and tested and you're very confident with. You don't want to do one or the other, because if you're doing stuff you've already done before, it's not going to be interesting to you. It's not going to be something you're passionate about. It's something you've already done. But if you're trying to innovate on every single level, you're going to overscope yourself. You're going to bring loads of additional risk to the project. So you want basically a balance of the two, something that you're really comfortable with, but then features and innovations that are going to be really interesting for the game, and something that's going to be new in terms of how you're going to market that to players and how to get players interested in your game. So it's a balance of the two things that's really important, I think.
That's really good to hear from that as well. We've got a question from Saul here. So he says marketing is such an important thing, especially for indie games. So what tips and tricks do you have for marketing?
I think it's really important to utilize all of the platform's tools. So if you're on Steam, if you're going to be on console, there's loads of different ways of getting your game out to players. So on Steam, the main kind of algorithm that's used is whether or not you have a lot of wish lists. The more wish lists you have, the more Steam shows that game to players. So then you'll get more wish lists, and wish lists are the thing that convert ultimately to sales, because if you wish list a game, it'll tell you when the game's on sale. It'll tell you when the game's launched. It'll be higher up on the most wish lists kind of lists on Steam. So that's really important. But then also with Xbox and with Nintendo, there's opportunities to make game demos, there's opportunities to do pre-orders, and all of those are calculated to decide where you are on the rankings on the store. And it's kind of elusive to find out exactly how those algorithms work, but if you have a tool, I would suggest using it. If you're able to create a demo, then do so. If you're able to do a pre-order, then do so. A lot of companies just be like, I can't be bothered with that, but it makes such a big difference to whether or not a player is going to see your game, and that's really, really important. And then obviously don't underestimate the value of social media, or allowing people to play your game and give feedback, because the community will start talking amongst themselves and building hype themselves for your game, especially if you're answering questions that players are asking you. Yeah, I think it's super important. I can't understand how important like thinking about that stuff is. It really is key. So
that's fantastic. You mentioned social media there, and you mentioned a few times in your talks about reading stuff like comments on social media or Twitch streams. But how do you deal with maybe either negative feedback from the community or even positive? How do you take that on board?
It depends what it is. If it's just like, this game is trash, I can't do anything with that, and I'm just like, it's kind of funny. I don't know. Not everyone's going to like your game, and you have to just be okay with that. No matter what you do, someone's going to not like your game. That's just how it is, especially with something like The Division, where there's millions and millions and millions of players. There's going to be people that don't like it, and there's going to be people that love it and think and it's their favorite game, and that's just part of the course. But in terms of comments about like negative feedback, if it's got value to it, if it's actually something that is going to be feedback you can actually take on board, and if it's something that either a lot of players are saying or it's something you know yourself that you want to improve, then that's a point at which you'll be like, right, let's take that and let's make some changes to it. But yeah, it's just about evaluating everything on a case-by-case basis. Sometimes as well, like there's players that are extremely loud, but it doesn't represent the majority of players, because a lot of the players will just enjoy the game and they won't be on social media talking about it. They'll just be quietly enjoying it. And so you don't want to also like change the entire game based on a few like people who are very vocal. So it's very important that you analyze the feedback. You know your game the best. You designed the game. So it's very important that you analyze it on those lines and see if it does have value and if you think it's right for your game. Yeah.
That's amazing, especially when you said not everyone's going to like your game no matter what. So I think that's a really good thing for anyone to take out anything. We've got kind of another branching off question from social media. Josiah asks, how do you answer questions about your games without giving too much information out? How do you not spoil your game?
Well, obviously, when you work at a AAA studio, there's very strict NDAs about what you can and can't say. So it's better to err on the side of caution and not say anything. If you just don't say anything. But when it's my game, obviously, I know when the best time for to answer questions about the game. At the moment, we don't really talk about the game at all. We're not ready to yet. But in terms of answering questions, it's very much. It depends on what stage of the project you're at. It depends whether you think it's going to be a benefit to answer it. It's a case-by-case thing. It's difficult to answer that question because it's very case-by-case, and it's very easy to get that wrong as well, and answer something that there's different strategies. Like some independent game developers, very small studios, just like to put all sorts of updates out there from the very beginning, and that builds the community. But at the same time, that can create pressure from the community to build your game in a certain way. So again, it's a balancing act in terms of what you feel you want to make and how much feedback from the community you want to take. And it can be like a marketing tool to have that back and forth with players. I do like to be honest and transparent, particularly when things have gone wrong. If there's something that even we think is a problem or we want to improve in the game, I'd rather be honest about that than try and gloss over it with, I don't know, a trailer or pretend it's not a thing. I'd rather just be like, yeah, you're probably right about that, and this is what we're doing to rectify it. And this, or yeah, you're right about that, but the way this system is set up, it's going to be basically impossible for us to fix it right now, but we'll definitely consider that for a sequel. Yeah, I think there's different ways to handle it depending on the situation.
Fantastic. I want to take it back into you working in the industry and maybe the bigger companies. But were you reporting to multiple leads at the same time? And if you were, what were the communication like? Was there any difficulties with that? Were you getting mixed messages, or was it all quite uniform?
Yeah, it's very easy because at a big company, there's multiple directors. So for a small company, you might have one game director, one creative director who determines basically the vision for the whole game. With a bigger studio, you might have a creative director in one studio, a creative director in another. You might have the creative director, the game director, the art director, and sometimes they're not aligned. And it's very important for them to be aligned because otherwise they give inconsistent feedback, and that's definitely an issue. And at that point, it's just better to get everybody together in the same room to talk it out and figure out a direction to go. So if someone like says one thing in one ear and one thing in another, that instead of just like listening to the last thing that someone's told you, it's better to try and get them in a room and get them to agree or get them to talk it out and decide a pathway, because it's definitely better to decide something than to just wait and not do something. You'll get decision paralysis by not making those decisions or being worried about making them. So it's better to set a direction, and if the direction is not the right one, you can always change course. If you don't do anything, you're just going to be stagnant and be stuck there. So it's better to just have those conversations, and it definitely does happen where there's lots of conflicting feedback. And even within the dev team, there'll always be conflicts about what the right thing to do for the game is. But yeah, it's about having those conversations, and you can also use the playtesting data. You can also use the reviews that you've had to kind of try and get on the same page. There's loads of tools for just getting yourself aligned, and it doesn't always go to plan. But yeah, there's ways to solve it if it doesn't, and it's fine if it doesn't go to plan as long as you have an action plan to fix it, I think.
That's fantastic. I'm actually going to ask you a question about your talk, actually. You briefly talked about concept art and the importance of it. But any prospecting concept artists or some of our students who may really want to be a concept artist, what is the biggest advice and what is the biggest lessons you could teach them?
Probably the biggest thing that I see that's an issue is there's a massive difference between marketing art and concept art. And so a lot of people will spend hours and hours on doing these beautiful pieces from like one angle, and they look amazing, but they're like marketing art, they're like box art. It's not something that a 3D artist can take and then create as an asset. So it's fine if things are a bit rougher looking, as long as you're saying, what type of material. So say you're doing a character, you want to see the character from different angles. You want to see examples of what materials their clothing are going to be, what kind of color palettes you might have. It doesn't necessarily to this beautiful finished piece of rendered artwork, because that's not something an artist is going to be able to take and make. And you can include those pieces on your portfolio. It's nice to see your skills and taking something from concept to final. That's important. But as long as you have that stage of working and your process of working, that's really important to have, not just the finished piece. So that's the most common mistake I see in concept art portfolios, is just not considering the pipeline. And if you're a concept artist and you can work with a 3D artist or an animator, I'd highly recommend getting that experience if you can. Just forming a small team and taking a character from concept to 3D, because it's not just a pipeline where you're like, right, I've done the concept, bye, I'm done. There's loads of back and forth. There's like, okay, well, I'm the 3D artist, like what is going on with this equipment you've put on here? And there's a back and forth, and maybe you'll draw some more diagrams to help the 3D artist figure that out. So there's back and forth, and if you can get that practice, that's really, really useful, I think.
Kind of branching off that, how important would you say communication is with your concept artist and the entire team?
it's the most important thing, because it's stuff that people underestimate also, I think, because I remember when I was at uni, we had a lot of group projects and people were like, oh, I hate group projects, and moaning and groaning about it. But the game industry, most of the time, it's going to be a group project. It is just one big group project. You're going to be talking to people all the time, unless you're a solo dev, which is less and less common these days. You'll be working as a team. So just figuring out how those pipelines integrate with each other, how to talk to each other, how to give feedback to each other. Like, I can't understate how important that is to learn. And if you can get experience of it before you enter the industry at uni, take advantage of the group project. Don't be like, oh, I hate these. I don't understand the benefit, because there's so many benefits to it. It's just trying to replicate what industry's like. And if you're working in a group project and you don't have a producer, think about how you can plan the project together and communicate, how you want to progress, how you see the vision for the project, and get involved in all of that as well. I think that can be super useful.
That's fantastic. We've got a few more questions left. And I know a few of our viewers today have got questions about actual bugs in the game. What the question is, what are the type of bugs that are quite common in the game? And then you also mentioned how these days games can ship with bugs. How do you decide which bugs are able to ship and which ones aren't?
So normally all the bugs are prioritized by how severe they are or how frequent they are. So it's both like how serious they are and how likely you are to come across it. So you might have a crash and you would think, oh, that's really severe. But if it's a crash that only happens like 1 in 2,000 times, it's very rare a player will see it, or the steps to reproduce the crash are extremely uncommon, it might be okay to ship with that crash. So it's important to kind of note down the probability of finding the bug in the first place as well. So yeah, normally that's something you would track when you're putting bugs into your database. You'd have both of those things, like how severe it is and how common it is to find it. Common bugs you normally find, or common bugs that you might ship with, are things like missing textures, like Z fighting, which is like there's some flickering in the texture and things like that. Things that don't affect the game, don't break the flow of game, don't break any combat or any systems that are core to the game. Maybe visual bugs you might be okay to ship with, depending on how severe they are. We've all seen the like Assassin's Creed bugs where it's just eyeballs and teeth. That's probably not okay. But yeah, there's obviously levels to those as well. And yeah, again, depending on what type of game it is, there's bugs that you commonly see. Graphical errors. There's a lot of bugs that come from putting the game from PC to console as well. Those usually cause graphical errors. So yeah, you get used to what to look for. A lot of audio issues, like audio cutting out, stuff like that. Sound effects not playing are common. But yeah, it's good to look out for them because it does impact the overall quality.
Fantastic. So we've got one last question for you. But what is the major difference, what you see from working in AAA to indie? And we're talking about stuff like the smaller things like the feature lists or your day-to-day. What's the major differences?
I think indie, it's easier to communicate just because you have a smaller team. And so therefore things tend to be less structured. So they might have a lot more casual meetings, they might have less meetings. Whereas in AAA, you're spending a lot of time trying to get people on the same page. And there's advantages and disadvantages to both. So in AAA, you'll have the world at your feet in terms of software and hardware and all that kind of stuff. So tools and stuff can solve problems for you. But you will need to have a lot more standardized processes. So things across the board that will allow you to get a picture of the whole game. So teams tend to have a bit less freedom, but a lot more structure that help them develop their part of the game. Whereas sometimes indies are extremely chaotic though, and that can be a problem. Like they don't have that producer to say, this is how you would structure a game, or this is how you would do a timeline. So there can be total chaos in indie as well. So yeah, I think it's good to tailor what you're doing to the company, but also having structure. Having a feature list for a small company is still vital. And even if you're indie, it's still useful to go through those processes, just a lighter version of them, to make sure that your game's well planned. I think it's still vital for a small company as well.
Fantastic, fantastic. So I just want to say thank you so much for your talk. I'm sure everyone in the chat is going to say thank you so much. We normally get a couple of claps or applauses. I've learned so much from that chat, and I hope the about nearly 200 other people in this call have learned.
Yeah, I can't believe there's 200. That's awesome.
It is
Thanks
amazing.
very much for coming, everybody. Oh, also, I'm on Twitter, so I'm totally happy to get DMs from people. If you want me to look at your portfolio, I realize there's 200 people, so maybe not all 200 of you. We'll see. We'll see how that goes. But yeah, you'd be welcome to DM me with additional questions later if you want. I'm always happy to do that. I have a really annoying Twitter handle, so I can tell you it, but you wouldn't find me. So yeah.
That's fantastic. It's fantastic. Like I say, thank you so much. Now, before you go, I just want to say thank you everyone for coming. There is a couple of other events going on today. There's a small event for us. You may have heard of him. A guy called John Romeo is going to be talking to us about his time in industry. Him and his wife, who are both gaming veterans, are going to talk about some of their experiences. And this is the final day of Confetti Industry Week. It's been a fantastic week so far. Like I say, it was our 15th Confetti Industry Week, so a massive thank you for joining us. We're all going to just jump out now, so as my colleague would say, we're going to kick out the pesky students, and then we're going to have a quick talk with you just at the end. So fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll see you all later.